Well, hello. How are you? Hopefully, everybody's doing well. Tonight, we are continuing our study through the book of Daniel here on the Revelation Explained. Um, you know, like, share, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and let's get right in so that we can try and cover everything we want to cover. We're going to be looking at about 30 verses, and we want to try and cover all of those tonight, and so it may take us a minute. So let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to pull up our trusty, Bibles, and we are going to begin with Daniel chapter 2, starting with verse 1, and we're just going to read through to verse 30. And if you got any questions or comments as we go, you can make those known in the chat, and we will address them as we go. So let's go ahead and we're going to read out of the new NASB, the New American Standard, and we'll read these 30 verses, and then we'll go back and going to lay the sort of the groundwork. And then what we're going to do is look at how Daniel gives us a model for dealing with the culture and dealing in particular with a hostile culture. So let's read. Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. The king replied to the Chaldeans, The command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. And the king replied, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, that I may know that you may declare to me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time, in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed of Daniel in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king. Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream, and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any reason, any wisdom residing in me more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. All right, so 30 verses. It's a lengthy passage, but I believe that we can get through it all tonight. We're just going to sort of take it a bit at a time. Really, it's broken up into two parts. The first part, Daniel's not in, and then the second part, Daniel sort of plays the featured role. So we're going to look at the setup that we find in the first half of this passage, and then we will look at where Daniel enters in. And what we'll see in that section is how Daniel gives us a model for living in a hostile culture. And Alice, I see that you commented. It's good to see you. I'm glad that you're with us tonight. Anybody else? Please leave a comment. I'd love to see you. So, real quick, it begins with this comment. Now, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. And what this tells us is that Nebuchadnezzar, this is taking place about 2 years or so after Daniel arrives in Babylon. And so if you'll remember from when we first started, Daniel was probably about 14, 15, 16 years old when he first comes to Babylon. So now he's probably around 17 or 18 years old. So he's still a young man. You know, a lot of times when we read Daniel, we think of some of the pictures where Daniel's this old, bearded, long, white-bearded man. But Daniel is a young man here. I mean, we're talking about 17 or 18 years old when all of this happens. So have that in mind as you think about the wisdom that Daniel already shows, even as a young man. So he's still young, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has this dream, and he has an unsettling dream. It says that his spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. In other words, he couldn't get enough sleep. This was something that was fairly common in the day. In fact, there's a Greek historian named Herodotus that notes some Median Persian kings about 100 years after Nebuchadnezzar who had these unsettling dreams about the future, and that their wise men came and sort of told them about, you tried to interpret them for them. So this was a fairly common thing, this whole idea of a ruler having a dream that told what was going to happen into the future. Or at least it was a commonly believed thing. So this is what Nebuchadnezzar has, but Nebuchadnezzar has a problem. And part of the problem, there's a little bit of debate in this, but I think part of the problem is Nebuchadnezzar doesn't fully remember exactly what the dream is. I think this is one of the reasons that he forces the wise men to tell him what the dream was and its interpretation. Now, part of it is he wants to really know that they know what they're talking about, but I have a feeling that Nebuchadnezzar also isn't totally sure and doesn't completely remember what the dream was. And so he has a part of it, and it's enough to know that it's bad. And that what is going to happen, what it portends, what it looks forward to, is not good for him. And when we keep reading and we actually look at the dream, which we'll do next week, we'll see that it most certainly is pretty obvious to anybody that the dream is not a good dream, that this is more of a nightmare. So here at Nebuchadnezzar he has this nightmare, he wakes up, he probably doesn't fully remember it. And most of us have probably been there before. We've had a dream, and we sort of remember patches of it here and there, but the fullness of it we really can't recollect. But we remember it was a bad dream. And I think this is where Nebuchadnezzar finds himself. And so this is why his spirit is troubled. Apparently, according to sort of this Middle Eastern superstition, it was ominous. It was an ominous sign if you could not remember a dream like this. Here's a quote from one of the commentaries I came across. If a man cannot remember the dream he saw, then it means that his personal God is angry with him. And so until the dream was both recalled and interpreted, it sort of hung over his head as an evil dream, and it would continue to bother him, and it would continue to defile him until he could remember the dream and have it interpreted. So this is part of the reason why Nebuchadnezzar is so concerned about this dream. Not only because he knows it's a bad dream and he has a feeling that it's telling something about the future, but also because of this cultural reason, that it was this ominous thing to wake up in the middle of the night to have this dream and then not be able to fully remember it. So Nebuchadnezzar, he calls in all of the wise men. He calls in, it gives us 4 words here: the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dream. This is what he's, and I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. But we give all 4 of these words, and all 4 of these words have slightly different meanings. The magician was used of dream interpreters in the Assyrian court. Conjurers was a Babylonian term used for magicians who could interpret signs and also conduct rituals to change the outcome of what those signs were going to lead to. Sorcerers referred to people who were skilled in charms and incantations. It was used in the Old Testament to refer to sort of those sinful, sinful magicians in the Old Testament. I think of the people that Saul cast out of the land of Israel, made them all leave. Those were the sorcerers. And then the Chaldeans is actually originally just a term for a people group, for the Chaldeans. I mean, it's like, the English. But over time, it came to be used of a certain kind of magician, somebody who had access to secret knowledge and could tap into mysteries and reveal things. So what's interesting about the way Daniel writes this here is that we get these four words: the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans. And I think what he's doing is he's showing us just how much Babylon has access to knowledge and to wisdom. I mean, they got all these different groups of people who all supposedly have access to hidden knowledge, to greater wisdom, to greater understanding, to greater learning. And Nebuchadnezzar, in order to solve this problem he's bringing all of these guys in. And so we've got this huge mass of people. And you would think that out of all of these people, with all of these experts who have access supposedly to all of this secret knowledge, that one of them would be able to help Nebuchadnezzar out and tell him his dream and the interpretation of it. And so it's building it up to where the Babylonians, it's like they have access to all of this knowledge. And yet, when he's got the crowd and he tells him what he wants to do, he says, I had a dream, my spirit's anxious. And they say, well, tell the dream. And he says, well, I want you to tell me what the dream is first, and then I want you to interpret it. And when he does this and he gives this command, it's crickets. Nobody can tell him anything. Nobody knows what the dream is. And so they're all stumped. Now, normally, the wise men, in order to interpret a dream, what they would have done is Nebuchadnezzar would have told, or whoever it was, he would have told them the dream. They would have listened to the dream. They would have gone, and there were huge books that they had, that in the past they had written down dreams that somebody had, and then they would write down the events that took place after that dream, and it sort of became this encyclopedia of dream interpretation. Over time, there would be certain elements maybe that were common to multiple dreams, and then certain things that happened after those dreams that were all in common, and they would say, okay, well then this must mean X, Y, or Z. And so they created these huge, books and books, and we've actually found examples of them archaeologically, books and books of these dream interpretation manuals, where these scholars and these wise men would go to the dream interpretation encyclopedia, and they would look up what the different aspects of the dream meant, so that they can then interpret them and tell the person what it was that was going to happen. Now, Nebuchadnezzar throws a wrench into their plans, because he's not satisfied with them just hearing the dream and going to the encyclopedias and looking through them. He wants them to actually tell him what he dreamed, as well as tell him the interpretation of it. But the problem is that a dream happens in somebody's mind, and so there's no way for these wise men to access this information. There's no way for them to know what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. He was asking the impossible of these wise men. And so you have these four groups of wise men, probably a whole host of people in this room, and Nebuchadnezzar tells them this, and none of them can respond. None of them have an answer. What he's asking of them is an impossibility. I mean, it would be a incredibly lucky guess, maybe, that they might be able to have, but it's a practical impossibility that they would be able to tell him what the dream was, and then also tell him the interpretation. And yet, if you look at verses 5 and 6, the stakes are high for them to know what's going on. Because he says, if you don't know, and if you don't tell me, if you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made rubbish heaps. And so, I mean, this was literally dismemberment. And this was something that was common in the day. And so he's literally talking about, if they won't tell him the answer that he's looking for, then he's just going to dismember them completely. And he's going to make their house a rubbish heap. Again, this is something that historically we have evidence of, that when maybe a king was displeased, that they would take somebody's house and literally turn it into a public toilet. And so he is telling them that they're going to be dismembered, and their home, their legacy, their inheritance is going to be given over to trash, and possibly even to waste. And so the stakes are high. But if you look at the next verse, he tells us not only, what the sort of negative repercussions are if they don't do it, he also tells them the positive repercussions, that if they are able to, then they will receive gifts and a reward and great honor. We got 3 words there, all emphasizing the good things that they will receive if they get it right. The problem is they can't get it right. There's no way for them to get it right because what he's asking of them is impossible. So here you got all these guys, and he's asking the impossible of them, and the stakes are incredibly high, but there's nothing that they can do. So they just say, he tells them, he says, this is what I want you to do. And they just say, well, let the king tell the dream to his servants and we'll declare the interpretation. It's like they're just ignoring, what his command or what his, what he's asked them. They say, well, just tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. And he responds, well, no. I mean, it's like he doesn't fall for it. He doesn't get distracted. He's like, he immediately says, I know for certain that you're bargaining for time, in as much as you've seen that the command from me is firm. In other words, the thing I'm saying is going to, this is the way it's going to be, and I'm not going to give. You're either going to tell me my dream and the interpretation, or you're going to be dismembered, and I'm going to turn your house into a trash dump. He says, if you do not make the dream known to me, there's only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. So he's saying, listen, I know what you're doing. You're trying to stall for time. You're trying to get me to change my mind so that I don't do what I said I'm going to do. But I am going to do what I said I'm going to do. So tell me the dream so I can know that you can declare to me its interpretation. He says, listen, if you really have access to secret knowledge, if you really have access to the spiritual realm, and to all of the hidden knowledge that's there, if you really have access to the mysteries, then you can not only tell me the interpretation, you can also tell me the dream. Now, we might ask ourselves a question here. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon. He's got all of these guys that work for him, all these wise men who are advisors and who sort of act like the Old Testament prophets did for Israel's kings. They would tell him what was going to happen, and then they would warn him and maybe tell him that he should adjust some things, change this, don't do this, etc. Why would he be willing to kill all of these guys? I think that's a good question, and I think the reason that he would be willing to kill all of these guys is because based on his dream, which we're going to read next week, and based on his feelings of anxiety about that dream, Nebuchadnezzar likely thought that there was something bad afoot, and that perhaps there was someone in the royal court who was out to get him and kill him and take away his throne. This was something that was very common back in the day. In fact, there were several kings that came after Nebuchadnezzar who were assassinated so that somebody else could take the throne. So this was a very common thing. And Nebuchadnezzar probably has some anxiety about this, some fear about this. And who are the 2 groups of people most likely to mount an insurrection or a coup? Well, it's the military or it's your wise men. So Nebuchadnezzar's looking at all of these wise men, and he's probably a little bit, paranoid and suspicious, thinking, one of these guys could be out to get me, and he could try and interpret, my dream in a way that's going to lead to me being ruined and leading to me to disaster. In fact, we read about a Persian king about a century after this who killed a huge group of his wise men, because of some issues that took place. So this was not an unusual thing for the king, or an unprecedented thing for the king to decide, well, I'm just going to kill you all if you can't do this thing that I want you to do. It feels like Nebuchadnezzar may be a little paranoid, and is definitely fearful and anxious and worried, the fact that he's to the point where he's willing to kill all of these guys if they can't do something that they physically can't do. So in verse 10 and 11, the wise men respond to the king, and they make a really important and sort of astute statement, one that's going to be significant going forward. He says, or they say rather, there is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult or rare or impossible, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. So they're telling the king, listen, if you want somebody to tell you what your dream is and interpret it, the only place you can go is to the gods, because they're the only ones that might have access to your mind where the dream took place. But none of us have access to that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is probably thinking, yeah, but y'all are the wise men, and y'all are astrologers, and y'all have all this secret knowledge, so certainly you have access to the gods. So you should be able to go to the gods and get this information for me. unfortunately, they don't have access to the gods, or at least not the true God who actually knows what Nebuchadnezzar has dreamed. So this sets things up right here. This verse sets things up for Daniel to enter the scene. One who knows the true God, and one who has, that God will reveal things to, one that has access to that God. So we come to a place here at the end of verse 11 where the cultural riches and wisdom of Babylon are shown to be utterly bankrupt when the rubber meets the road. And when we have this need, all of the wisdom of Babylon falls short. They can't do what Nebuchadnezzar demands. And so Nebuchadnezzar can't put his hope in Babylon or in the wisdom of Babylon. And I think maybe we might learn a little bit about that we can't put our hope in anything of this world. Anything in this world, because everything in this world will eventually fail us. Even the most trustworthy people will eventually die. And so if our hope is tied to a certain person, if our hope is tied to a pastor or to a teacher or to a spouse or to children or to whatever, there's going to come a day when either I'm taken from them or they're taken from me, where that relationship is going to come to an end on this earth. So my hope can't be tied to any earthly thing, or I'm going to be disappointed. And that's where Nebuchadnezzar is. His hope is in Babylon and in his kingdom, and right now he's hoping that these, one of these wise men will be able to respond, and they can't. And so it makes sense what happens next in verse 12. Because of this, it says, the king became indignant and very furious. So we have, again, two words. We have that repetition, which always symbols sort of an emphasis. He becomes indignant and very furious. The king becomes angry. Why? Because this is what every earthly ruler, whether we're talking about an earthly king or we're talking about just a person who has their little earthly kingdom that they've created with their home and their job and their retirement fund and their family and all of their stuff. When any earthly kingdom, its weakness and frailty is laid bare, what do people do? They get angry. They get furious. They get indignant because they realize that there's nothing that they can do, that they're out of control, and they desperately want to feel in control, and then when that control is taken away, they get angry. This is what happens with Nebuchadnezzar. And so he gives the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon, to do what he said he was going to do, to dismember them and to turn all of their homes into trash dumps or bathrooms, including Daniel and his friends. So before we get into what happened, what Daniel does and how he responds and what that can teach us about how we can respond, let's just think for a minute about how bad things are for Daniel here. Daniel and his friends have been taken from their home. They've been taken from their friends. They've been taken from their land, from their ancestral homeland, from their family, from everything that they had grown up knowing. They were taken from that place and brought hundreds of miles away to Babylon, to this foreign city that worshipped a foreign god, that did things in a completely different way, that ate different kinds of food, and on and on and on. And so we've got Daniel and his friends being stripped out of their homeland, brought to this new place. And here they're put through 3 years, or 2 or 3 years, of intense training, being taught to think like a Babylonian and act like a Babylonian and speak like a Babylonian, and on and on and on, being trained to be sort of the perfect Babylonian wise men. And now, on top of it, they're about to be executed because the Babylonian wise men can't do something that is impossible to do. It doesn't get much worse than that. Hey, Daniel, it's good to see you. And Logos is wonderful. One of my favorite tools to use. So here, this is how bad things are now, as we're reading this. This is how bad things are, is that Daniel has been taken from everything that he's known. He's been put through this rigorous training program for the past 2 or 3 years of his life, and now he's about to be killed for something he has no control over. And so Daniel is in, culturally speaking, like the worst possible situation that you could be in. And so as I was thinking about this today, as I was reading this and I was studying, I'm thinking, how often do we complain and get worked up about things far, far less than what Daniel is experiencing here? Daniel is experiencing the ultimate in exile, in cultural hostility, in living in a world that hates you and that wants to put their ideas on you and for you to be conformed into their image and all of this. Daniel is living in this. And he's living in the kind of place where not only his freedom is taken away, but his very life is being threatened. And so we might ask ourselves the question, how does Daniel respond to this? Because if Daniel responds in a certain way to all of this, then it might shed some light on how we can respond to a similar situation, albeit a less intense one. If Daniel can face death and everything else, all of this cultural confusion and brokenness, if he can face this with grace and love, then maybe we can too. And I think that's what we ought to ask, is how then did Daniel respond? And when we read from about verse 14 down to 30, what we have are about 5 things that Daniel prioritized, that Daniel did, that reveal to us how we can live more faithfully despite finding ourselves in a very hostile culture. So, what are those 5 things? Well, the first thing we see right here in the very beginning of this part says, "Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he said to Arioch, the king's commander, 'For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?'" So Arioch comes. Arioch is the executioner. Arioch probably has a sword with him. He's coming to kill Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is the guy, this is the executioner coming for Daniel. And when Daniel sees him and he says, "What's going on?" And Arioch says, "Well, you're going to die," because none of the wise men could tell the king his dream. Daniel replies with discretion and discernment. Now, this word for discernment literally means taste. One commentator explains that it speaks of appropriateness or suitability. In other words, Daniel replies wisely and in good taste, in keeping with the occasion and the importance of the visitors. If you read this passage, what you'll find is that there are 2 things absent from Daniel's response that are very characteristic of how Christians are tempted to respond in hostile cultures. There's no fear in Daniel's voice, and there is no worry or anger in Daniel's voice. It would be easy for Daniel to hear this and immediately become terrified and say, "No, anything but that, no, please," and to become a basket case of fear. But he doesn't. Instead, he responds with discretion and discernment. It would be easy also for Daniel to have heard this and gotten angry and said, "It was not my fault. Go kill the other wise men. Nobody even came and told me anything about this. Why didn't they ask me?" It would be easy for Daniel to get angry, but he doesn't. He responds with discretion and discernment. There's no anger. There's no fear. Daniel faces the situation with discretion, with discernment, with wisdom, with grace, with love, and with faith. And he's doing it all while talking to the executioner. And so here Daniel finds himself facing this guy and facing him with grace and with love and faith. And when we think about this, we ought to ask ourselves the question, shouldn't we be able to do the same thing? When we find ourselves in a hostile culture, when the executioner comes our way and says, "Listen, it's over," why is it that we so often immediately default to fear and anger instead of to discretion and discernment and wisdom? See, that's what we need to begin to process and to live in alignment with, is discretion and discernment and wisdom, so that we don't react to everything going on in our culture and to the anger and the hostility and everything else with anger or with fear, but instead with discretion and discernment. Too often we lash out. Too often we overreact and we lash out at others and we get terrified and become afraid. And yet when we read Daniel, what we find is a man who has tremendous confidence in God. So much confidence that he's even able to face the guy who's holding the sword that's going to take his life, and he's able to do it without getting worked up. That is what we need as the people of God. That is faith. That is the grace of God at work. That is what sustained the martyrs over the past 2,000 years of Christian history when they faced the same thing Daniel did, and they too were able to respond with discretion and discernment. I'm reminded of Polycarp, as he faces the executioner, and the Romans are trying to get him. Polycarp was one of the early Christian martyrs in the 2nd century, and the executioner is trying to get him to recant, to throw away his commitment to Christ and his confession. And Polycarp responds. He's death is right there. He's about to die. And Polycarp responds, I think something along the lines of 86 years have I served my Lord, and he's never done me wrong. How can I, deny him now? Polycarp is able to respond with discretion and discernment, even in the face of death. He's not afraid. He's not angry. Why? Because he has faith in a God who is in control, even when things seem to be spiraling out of control. This is the kind of confidence, the kind of faith under pressure that causes people to ask, what kind of person is this? And how is it that a person can be so gracious and so loving and so discerning and wise and filled with faith? How can somebody do that when they're facing this much pressure and these many bad situations? This is the reason that Christianity has consistently grown during times of persecution, because Spirit-empowered people did not respond with fear or anger, but instead responded with faith, and that faith caught people's eye. And people said, how in the world are you able to do that? I want to know more. And this is how the Christian faith spread for the first, it's the way that it spread for the past 2,000 years in places where persecution's taken place. So the first thing we got to understand when we think about how we respond in a hostile culture is that we respond in faith, with wisdom and faith, and not with anger or with fear. So this is the first thing. There's another thing, though, that Daniel shows us of how we can live in a hostile culture. One of them is right here, starting in verse 16. It says, so Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. So Daniel says, listen, I'll be able to do it. Just give me a little bit of time. That's that faith that we see. Then in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, about the matter, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And so what does Daniel do? Where does he go when everything is going wrong and when it looks like he's facing the end of the line? Where does Daniel go? He goes to the Father, and they have a prayer meeting. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get on their knees and they pray to the God of heaven, and they ask for him to intervene, because they recognize that there is nothing in them that's going to be able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream is, but that there is a God in heaven, as they say, who is able not only to give the interpretation, but also to tell the dream. And this is what Daniel and his friends do. They recognize God as the God of heaven, the one who is over all, who is above all, and who is able and willing to concern himself, even though he is above all, to concern himself with human affairs and with the concerns of people. And so Daniel responds in prayer. This is what we ought to do. And we ought to ask ourselves the question, do we have that same response to our cultural problems? Do we consistently bring our cultural problems, when we look around us and we see everything going, sideways, when we look at the culture and we see, the immorality, the sexual immorality, when we see the violence, we see all of the stuff that happens in our culture, the hate and the oppression and the bitterness and the unforgiveness and on and on and on. When we look around us, do we immediately, like Daniel, go to the Father in prayer? Or do we look for somebody to blame? Is it easier for us to air our sort of cultural grievances to our friends and our family and complain about how everything is so bad around the dinner table? Or to get on Facebook and to rant because, or social media just in general, and rant because of how bad things are? Or do we take those things to the Father? Do we take all of those issues, do we take them out on other people with our words, with our actions, or do we take them to the Father and entrust them to him and understand that he is able to deal with these problems far better than we are able to? Because here's the truth. Here's the deal. This is what we need to remember, that God is the only one who can transform hearts. He's the only one that can change minds. He's honestly the only one that can change much of anything. So he is the one that we must petition. I mean, we can do all kinds of petitions and all kinds of complaints, and we can air our grievances and on and on and on. And it might make us feel a little bit better. And especially, when other people are like, yeah, you're right. Things are really bad. And we sort of get a little bit of an amen corner. It might make us feel better for a minute, but at the end of the day, we have changed absolutely nothing. And yet if we go to the Father, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, well, if we go to the Father and we appeal to the God of heaven, we are accessing a God who holds the world in his hands and who is actually able to do something about them, unlike us and unlike all of the people around us. God then is able to give us direction for what to do next, and this is what he does for Daniel. He gives him the dream, and he gives him the interpretation. It says here in verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. And so Daniel receives, he receives the mystery. He receives the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has had, and he receives the interpretation. And what we have next is the third piece, the third important thing that we can learn from Daniel here, that we ought to be practicing. Remember the first one, that we ought to live out of wisdom and faith. The second one, that we live out of prayer. The third one, that we live out of praise. Daniel receives the vision, he receives the interpretation, and then he begins to bless the God of heaven. And when we read this psalm that Daniel sings here in verses 20 through 23, what we find is that Daniel exalts God for two big things: the wisdom of God and the power and the control of God. And he gives God praise. Now, what's interesting about this is it would be easy, knowing that Daniel's in all this danger. I mean, he's facing the executioner. Remember, the executioner was just here the day before, and he had his sword, and he was ready to dismember Daniel and turn his house into a trash dump. And it would be easy for Daniel to wake up, to have this vision, to realize he now has the interpretation, he has the dream, and immediately to rush out the door to go fix the problem, right? And sometimes we do that. We think we have this big idea, and we think, oh, this is going to fix all the problems, and we rush out the door to go get to work, and we don't take the time first to give God praise and to give God thanks for being the one who answered the prayer. It reminds me a little bit of, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, there's a story about Jesus healing these 10 lepers, and they all go to the temple to go make the sacrifice that's required, and only one of them returns back to Jesus to give him thanks and to give God glory and praise that he has been healed. And Jesus says, where are the other 9? Weren't all 10 made whole? And yet it's only this one who returned to give God praise and give God glory. Daniel gives God praise, and he praises him with the psalm of just pure praise for God's wisdom and for God's power. Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It's he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. Throughout this, Daniel is praising God for his wisdom and for his power. And he's recognizing that he deserves all of the praise and all of the glory. And we'll see that Daniel continues to do this throughout the rest of this chapter. Hold on a second. It's important for us to remember that God's people have always been a people of praise. Even when things aren't going our way, even when we don't understand, even when everything seems lost, we are, as the people of God, a people of praise, because we understand that God is the final arbiter of what will and won't happen, that he's the one who gets the final say, and that nobody on this earth and no thing on this earth gets the final say like God does. And as a result, we can praise God even when things aren't going our way, because there is a God in heaven who loves us, who cares for us, and who is going to have the last word. Not just some of the last words, but the last word. I know some of us, we like to have the last word in discussions, and so, we'll try and get the last word in. God always gets the last word, and nobody gets to speak up after he has spoken. We should be, as Christians, marked off as different from the surrounding culture, just like Daniel was, because we are a people of praise. And so we should give God the praise that's due his name for his wisdom, for his power, and on and on. But I think his wisdom and his power would be great things for us to praise God for in the culture in which we live. Now, again, I would ask us the question, is the average Christian's conversation marked by praise of God? Is it marked by giving God glory? Is that my conversation? Is it yours? Is it my life and yours? Or are our lives more characterized by criticism and anger and fear and nitpicking and pride and arrogance and mocking and on and on and on? See, Daniel understood that praise has to come first. So Daniel is living out of wisdom and faith. Daniel is living out of prayer. Daniel's living out of praise. But we also see that Daniel is living out of love. Right here in verse 24. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch. This is the executioner, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows. Now listen to this, because this is important. Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. This would be a great opportunity for Daniel to say, hey, have you killed the other wise men yet? And for Arioch to say, well, not yet. And him say, okay, well, once you're finished with that, then I'll talk to you. to get rid of these guys. After all, these are pagans, these wise men of Babylon. They're not followers of God. And here Daniel is. He's a faithful follower of God who's trying to do what's right. These wise men, it must have been a temptation to say, well, go ahead and let those guys be gone, because not only are they pagans, and so they don't think like Daniel, they don't act like Daniel, they don't live like Daniel, they're sinful, and they're not followers of God. But on top of it, if they're out of the way, who knows? Daniel might be able to move up in the ranks. I mean, Arioch could clear out a whole way for Daniel to be promoted to the very top. And so Daniel would have all kinds of reasons for not wanting to save the wise men of Babylon, and yet he walks in, and the first thing he says is not, hey, let me save my own skin, or hey, let me save the skin of my friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or let me save the skin of my fellow Jews. No, Daniel's first concern is, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. He's concerned about everybody who's here. And so what we see is a love and a concern for others here in the life of Daniel, that this is the way that he lived, loving other people. And again, if we think about this in terms of our own sort of cultural Babylon that we find ourselves in, modern Western culture as it is, very hostile to the Christian faith and the ways of the Christian faith, we would be wise to ask, would I say this about my cultural enemies? You know, if my political or cultural enemies were about to be destroyed, maybe not killed, but just destroyed, be ruined, would I say, don't destroy them? Or would I sit back and say, oh yeah, and would I kind of smirk and nod my head and say, well, they got what they deserved because they weren't followers of the true God, and if they would have been, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. Would I say, God, do not destroy, the whatevers of America? Would I try and intercede for them as Daniel does, the wise men of Babylon? Or would I sit back and be kind of happy about it because I got some people out of the way that really kind of needed to be gotten out of the way? How deep does our love go? This is the question. How deep does our love go for the lost people around us? Or does our love only extend to those people that we like and we get along with and that like us and that benefit us, and on and on? See, what Daniel reveals in the way that he lives, even in this very hostile culture, is he loves the people and he cares about the people, even if they don't like him or agree with him or are followers of God, even if they are total pagans, even if they're pagan leaders, even if they are the wise men of Babylon. Daniel cares enough about them to, the first thing he says when he gets to the executioner is, don't destroy them. I think Daniel has the heart of God in that he wants salvation for people, not destruction. It sort of goes back to what Ezekiel says about God, that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. That's the heart that Daniel has. And we ought to ask ourselves the question, do I live my life, even in this culturally hostile or, sort of world that we live in, even this hostile culture, do I live my life in such a way that I genuinely, deeply love the lost people around me? Or do I just look at them with disdain? Daniel loved. So, Daniel lived out of faith and wisdom. He lived a life of prayer. He lived a life of praise. And he lived his life out of love. But that's not the only thing. There's one more thing that Daniel reveals to us about the way that we can exist in this culture. Daniel goes into the king and he makes this beautiful statement here. Right here in verse 27. It says, Daniel answered before the king, and he said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. Now at this point, Nebuchadnezzar must have been thinking, then why in the world are you wasting my time? I could have had you all dead yesterday, and you came in here and said you needed a little more time in order to tell me what the dream was and what the interpretation is. Then, and now you come in here and say that there's no way that anybody can know it. So Nebuchadnezzar is probably thinking, what in the world did I do? But then Daniel says something that's very significant in verse 28. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries, that's God, has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me, more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. So, what is this last thing that Daniel reveals to us about living in a hostile culture? The last thing is that we live in a way that points to God. When we read this here, when we read Daniel coming in and describing the king's dream and telling the king what is taking place, Daniel is not taking any credit for it. In fact, he explicitly says, this mystery has not been revealed to me because of any wisdom residing in me more than any living man. In other words, what he's saying is, I don't know this because I'm smarter than everybody else in the room. I don't know this because I'm smarter than your wise men and your diviners and magicians and sorcerers and Chaldeans. I don't know this because I'm great or smart or wise. I know this because there is a God in heaven who knows everything. And he has revealed it to me so that you could know that the interpretation I'm giving you is true. See, Daniel doesn't take any credit at all for this. He points Nebuchadnezzar to God, and he points Babylon to God, who is over all and in all and through all. He points the most powerful nation in the world to God and says there is one who is more powerful even than you. And so Daniel uses this as an opportunity to share the truth about who God is, the gospel as Daniel knows it. And in fact, when we get to the end of this chapter, what you will see is that Nebuchadnezzar takes this to heart. Down here in verse 46, and King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. And the king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Daniel points to God, and he lives his life, not just here, but what we'll find is throughout this entire book, Daniel lives his life in such a way that everything points back to God. And he is constantly saying, it's not me. I'm not, it's not because I'm smart or I'm wise or I'm intelligent or I'm good looking or I'm anything. It's because there is a God in heaven who is able to do even the impossible. And Daniel does this. And because of this, even King Nebuchadnezzar is able and willing to fall on his face and say, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Nebuchadnezzar realizes the God of heaven. He comes to a greater understanding of who God is. Now, does this mean that he gets saved? No, I don't think so. But he comes to a better understanding of who God is because of Daniel pointing to God and allowing God to work through him. And I think that if that was true of Daniel, it is also true of us. We must live a life of pointing people to Christ. If we aren't, then we are failing in the Great Commission. This is the reason that we have to be so careful about the way that we speak and the things that we say and the things that we do and what we put on social media and everything else. Because when we are out there in the world, people are watching us. If we are Christians, if we claim the name Christ, if we have given our allegiance to the kingdom of God, people are watching us. And they want to know, how are you going to respond to this? What are you going to say? How are you going to act? Are you going to be consistent with what you claim to believe, or are you going to, throw it under the table when it's not convenient for you and when you'd rather do something else? The world is watching. Are we, like Daniel, pointing people again and again to God, or are we acting with arrogance and with pride and with, bitterness and anger and vulgarity and on and on and on? How are we living, and what are we presenting to the world, the watching world around us? We do not engage with our culture, just like Daniel. Daniel is not engaging with the culture to score points or to win political battles or even to save his own skin. I don't believe that for a second. Yes, does Daniel want to live? I think sure, like anybody. But that's not the sole reason. Daniel is doing this because he wants to point to God. He wants God's glory to be revealed and his power to be revealed. He wants people to be pointed to him. He wants ultimately to reveal Christ. That rock that Daniel prophesies about through this dream here in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. This stone, this kingdom of God that's going to crush all of the other kingdoms, the Rome and Medo-Persia and Greece and Babylon. The kingdom of God and the King Jesus. So, as we find ourselves navigating in a Babylonian culture, as Western society has become, are we approaching things in a measured, wise, faith-filled way, or are we approaching it in fear and anger? Are we approaching things prayerfully, like Daniel, or are we approaching things in our own strength and with our own wisdom and with our own words? Are we approaching things full of praise for God, Or are we approaching things full of, our latest grievance or the thing we're most upset about? Are we approaching things with that praise on our lips? Are we approaching things out of love for others, even our enemies? Or are we approaching things with love only for the people that like us and that are like us? Like Daniel, are we loving people? Are we praying? Are we praising? Are we living faithfully and full of wisdom? And are we approaching all of life with one finger pointed up to God, trying to draw attention not to ourselves or to our wisdom or our understanding or how wonderful or whatever we are, but instead back to Him, the God of heaven, our Creator, our Redeemer, our Savior? See, Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 30 reveals that if we are going to live a faithful life, a life where God is honored in a hostile culture like Daniel found himself in and like we find ourselves in, we must do so with wisdom, with faith, with prayer, with praise, with love, and with a God-centered vision and perspective. I believe if we will do that, if we will follow Daniel's example, then what we will find is that even when things don't go our way and things are going poorly and people don't like us and people are hostile and everything else, we'll be able to live confidently and boldly because we'll have right perspective and because God will have prepared us to face whatever it happens to be. And ultimately, I believe that if we will do that, we will see people saved because they will look at us and say there's something different about that person and the way that they're living. Now, we can't do any of this apart from God's empowerment from His Holy Spirit. And I would encourage you that if you, have never given yourself to Him, that right now is a great time to simply make confession, to repent, to ask for His Holy Spirit to move and to empower you, to give yourself wholly to Him. And He is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that you can ask or hope or think. So that is Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 30. I'm excited about next week because next week we're actually going to be looking at the vision, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and that Daniel received from God and the interpretation as well. And this is where Daniel begins to get really good. So I hope that you'll be back next week. Should be here on Monday, 7 o'clock. God bless you, and I will see you then.